IBM SPSS Statistics comes with default settings for how the software works, how the data are handled, and how the output is displayed. Now, while those default settings may be exactly what you want, you can also customize SPS settings to adjust the look and the feel of SPSS. So let's dive deeper into how to customize SPSS to look and function even better. To customize the SPSS settings options, we will be changing the global settings. Now, don't worry that you're going to break something. If you change something, you can always change it back. We will begin by choosing Edit, Options. Specific settings are in the tabs along the top of this window. As we work through each tab, you do not need to make every change that I suggest. Most of the default settings will work just fine. However, now you will know what options are available to you. We will start with the General tab. In Variable Lists, you can set the default for whether labels or names appear in the data editor. I prefer to show variable names. Remember that in any analysis menu box, you can switch between labels and names by right-clicking on any variable and in the variables box choosing Display Variable Names or Display Variable Labels. Output. Choose no scientific notation for small numbers in tables. If you are not used to working with scientific notation, this will make the output much easier to read. If you are comfortable with scientific notation, then leave it turned on. Language. Leave it set to whatever language you use. I prefer English. However, if you want to practice doing statistics in a foreign language, you can do so here. The Viewer is the name for the output window, the window that pops up after you run an analysis. In the initial output state, under Item, we see a list of icons, which are also mimicked in this drop-down menu. When you run an analysis, certain output is created, but you are not shown all of the output. If you want to see or to hide what appears, you can do so here. For example, when you export an analysis to Word, you will see a table called Notes that was hidden in the viewer. If you want to show the notes in the output, you could choose them here. If you want the notes to not appear in the exported output, I will show you how to remove the notes coming up. The checkbox option for Display Commands in the log will include the command syntax in the exported output, which is called the log. For Title, Page Title, and Text Output, you can see the text default settings in the output window here. A sans serif font is one that is smooth, like Arial, Helvetica, or Calibri. A serif font has the small superlative called serifs on the letters, making them easier to read at small font sizes. If you want your titles in Times New Roman, Palatino, or Cambria, you could set that here. A monospaced font is one in which every letter takes up the same amount of space, in contrast to a proportional font, which gives wider letters more space. I would recommend leaving the fonts at their default settings, unless you specifically want to choose another monospaced font like Monaco or Courier. I would also recommend changing the default page setup orientation from portrait to landscape, because it makes it easier to work with wider tables later on. In the Data tab, you can set the defaults for the data view. So for example, display format for new numeric variables. If you tend to use a lot of whole numbers, yes or no response variables coded as 1 and 0, you might as well set the default settings for decimals to 0. Then, when you need to, you can reset the decimals to 2 by hand, but only for the variables that you choose. Note that the decimals displayed will not affect the values actually used for calculations in SPSS. So if a score is 4.23, it will display as 4 with 0 decimals, but the value of 4.23 would be used by SPSS for calculations. You can also set the default column width here. Make the default larger if you use larger numbers, or perhaps smaller if you have lots of ones and zeros. This is your personal preference. If you are likely to be analyzing really large data sets, thousands of entries, then change Transform and Merge options to Calculate Values Before Used. Set century range for 2-digit years. If you type 14 in a years variable, SPSS will understand that as the year 2014. You can customize the leading numerals here if you routinely use dates for the American Civil War or for the Renaissance. Customize variable view. One of the options available in the variable view is roll. SPSS sets the roll by default to a setting that works well. In fact, I don't think I've ever readjusted the roll of a variable. So if you never use roll, you could turn it off here, and then it would not appear in variable view. If you are interested in being a minimalist, the only variable views that you really need for most analyses are the ones that SPSS shows you: name, label, type, and measure. There are other settings for the random number generator, measurement level, or for rounding. These should only be changed if you are using these options and you know how you want them to perform differently. If you are not satisfied with the performance of your fuzz bits, adjust them here. Under the Currency tab, there are not many options. Decimal separator, the default setting here will depend upon the region in which the software is sold. In America, we use decimals to separate currency values. If you are somewhere in the world where you prefer to use commas, you can set that here. For output, outline labeling. Choose if you want to see labels or variable names, or labels versus values, and this mostly depends upon your variables. These settings can also be toggled on or off later in the data view window. In the charts option, we have plenty of changes. SPSS charts are notoriously ugly. If you want a chart that you can use for a publication or a class paper, you have to reformat the chart, change the bar color, and remove the shading used in the chart editor. To save yourself some time while making all of your charts look closer to APA style, choose Style Cycles, Colors. Change that ugly honey mustard yellow to the clean APA style gray. For frame, remove inner. Now, all of your charts will look better. You will still need to do some formatting later, but much of that reformatting has now already been done for you. SPSS also offers templates for your charts, which you can access here. We will use a template for the tables in a moment. None of the output in SPSS will be in APA style. You can get your tables to display more closely to APA style by changing the template for the table look. Under Table Look, you may remember that with version 24, we got some rather nice gray shading on the tables. If you want the standard output to be classic without the gray shading, choose Classic Default. You can also check out various other default settings for how the tables will look. But if you will be using APA style, choose APA times Roman 12 point. Now this is not a perfect fix. I expected that the findings would print in 12 point Times New Roman, but instead I get a Helvetica font. However, when I export the findings to Microsoft Word and I change the font to Times New Roman 12 point, it looks great. So I would call this a workaround, but it still gives you some decent looking tables with only a little work. Sometimes you ask for tables that are too wide to fit on a standard width piece of paper. By default, SPSS will break the tables into multiple tables on separate lines. Changing to landscape view will help immensely, but there is one more improvement. For copying wide tables to the clipboard in rich text format, shrink to fit width. Now the font may be smaller, but everything will fit in your table. File locations can be a big help for organizing dataset and output. If you are using SPSS for a class, I suggest that you create a folder for all of your output for that class. Put that folder in a specific place on your computer, perhaps your Documents folder. Make that the default location. So if you are working on a specific project, like a thesis or a dissertation, or if you have one place on your computer where you like to keep your statistics files, you might as well let SPSS save all analysis there by default. Neither scripts nor syntax editor have any settings that I recommend changing from their default settings now. Now those are all the changes that I make in this section, but there's one more place to change the settings. Click on the Export button on any viewer or output window. Now click on Change Options. Earlier, I showed you where to make this same change, but we can also do it here. Click on Page Setup for Export. Change from Portrait to Landscape. This will make all of your tables and charts easier to view by giving them extra width. This is especially useful with large correlation matrices. Now click OK. Under Wide Pivot Tables, the default is for SPSS to wrap tables, which can make them more difficult to read. I would rather have a single table made smaller than to have it broken into multiple tables, so I change Shrink to fit within page margins. Click Continue. Note that the Export window also allows you to choose where the output will go, such as onto your desktop, in the Documents folder, or in another specified place. I'm going to use my Intro to Stats class folder in Documents. Finally, I find the inclusion of the Notes table in my output to be annoying. You can remove the Notes table by changing the setting for which objects to export to All Visible. If later you wanted to include a Notes table, you could simply turn this back on. So those are my suggestions for customizing SPSS for behavioral scientists. Of course, the field in which you work may require different customizations, or you may prefer the default settings. But now you know where to go so that you can play around with those options and make SPSS work with your data just the way that you want.